They called her a miracle until the real one was born. Adopted after 4 years of a barren marriage, Ilara Chisholm was the light of the Hallstrom home. But when biological daughter Serafina arrived a year later, the light vanished. For 15 years, Ilara became the family's ghost, a servant in a lace dress, while Serafina was groomed for royalty. Now, with the Hallstrom Empire drowning in billions of debt, they've struck a deal with the death god of Soul. To save their precious Serafina from the clutches of the notorious Kwon Ti-ryuk, they've traded Ilara instead. They forced her into a white gown and pushed her into the arms of a man known for ruthless cruelty, hoping he would break her so they'd never have to see her again. But as the bedroom door locks on their wedding night, the world's most feared mafia boss doesn't reach for a weapon. He reaches for her tears. While her family prayed for her suffering, Ti-ryuk has been waiting in the shadows for a decade with a dark, terrifying obsession. The Hallstroms sold a burden, but they accidentally gave the dragon his queen, and now he's coming for their throne. Would you marry a monster to escape your family, or is the devil you know safer? Hello, family. How are you doing? Before we proceed with the story, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop it in comment and subscribe to this channel if you are new here. Now let's proceed with the story. The golden light in the Hallstrom nursery once felt like a promise kept. For 4 agonizing years, Richard and Vivienne Hallstrom had lived in a hollow silence, their vast wealth unable to buy the one thing they craved, a legacy. The doctors had used words like incompatible and permanent, leaving the couple to navigate a marriage that felt more like a business contract in mourning. Then came Ilara. She was a tiny, deep brown miracle wrapped in a fleece blanket, her wide, soulful eyes taking in the Hallstrom mansion as if she had always belonged there. When they brought her home, Vivienne would sit for hours rocking her, whispering that she was the answer to every prayer. Richard, usually a man of granite and balance sheets, found his heart softening at the touch of her small, gripping fingers. For that first year, Ilara Chisholm was the center of their universe, the miracle child who had finally turned a house into a home. But miracles are often overshadowed by what the world considers natural. The shift happened on a humid Tuesday morning when Vivienne collapsed in the foyer. The diagnosis wasn't illness, it was a biological impossibility. A year after adopting Ilara, Vivienne was pregnant. The news spread through the social circles of the elite like wildfire. The Hallstroms were finally having a real child. The day Serafina was born, the atmosphere in the mansion changed. It wasn't a slow fade, but a sharp, clinical pivot. While Serafina was swaddled in silk and greeted by cameras, Ilara was moved. Her ornate hand-carved crib was dismantled and replaced by a simple bassinet in a smaller, darker room at the end of the hall. The miracle child had served her purpose as a placeholder, and now the biological heir had arrived to claim the throne. By the time the girls were toddlers, the love that had once been showered on Ilara had curdled into a cold, transactional tolerance. Vivienne's soft whispers were now reserved exclusively for Serafina, the golden child, whose every pout was treated like a royal decree. Ilara, with her quiet intelligence and observant eyes, learned early on that her presence was an inconvenience. She became the shadow in the family portraits, the child told to stand at the edge of the frame so she wouldn't clutter the image of the perfect Hallstrom bloodline. Be grateful, Vivienne would snap whenever Ilara looked longingly at the toys Serafina would inevitably break or discard. We plucked you from nothing. You owe us your life. Richard, once so captivated by Ilara's grip, now looked through her as if she were made of glass. To him, she was a failed investment, a reminder of a time when he thought his own blood was insufficient. He provided for her, food, clothes, a roof, but he withdrew the only currency that mattered, his gaze. Ilara grew up in a house filled with laughter that wasn't for her and warmth that stopped at the threshold of her bedroom door. She watched from the fringes as Serafina was dressed in designer labels and pampered by tutors, while she was given hand-me-downs and told to help the kitchen staff with chores to earn her keep. The girl who had once been the answer to a prayer was now a mistake the Hallstroms couldn't quite bring themselves to erase, so they chose to bury her in the background instead. By her 10th birthday, Ilara stopped asking for hugs. By her 15th, she stopped expecting to be noticed at all. She moved through the corridors like a ghost, her soft oval face gaining a mask of stoicism that hid the raging fire of a girl who knew she was worth more than the scraps of affection she was thrown. She was the miracle turned mistake, waiting in the silence for a world that would finally see her clearly. She didn't know yet that the shadows were watching her back, and that someone far more dangerous than the Hallstroms was already counting the days until he could claim the diamond they had mistaken for coal. The Hallstrom mansion hummed with the electric vibrance of a celebration that cost more than most people earned in a decade. It was Serafina's 21st birthday, and no expense had been spared to announce the golden child's ascension into womanhood. Upstairs, the ballroom was a sea of shimmering sequins and expensive champagne, the air thick with the scent of 5,000 imported lilies. Serafina stood at the center of it all, a vision of pampered arrogance in a bespoke silk gown, her laughter ringing out as she opened boxes from brands that didn't even put price tags on their merchandise. Downstairs, in the subterranean heat of the industrial kitchen, the air was different. It smelled of scorched sugar and the sharp tang of cleaning chemicals. Elara stood at a stainless steel prep station, her long, curly hair tied back tightly, her brow damp with sweat. While her sister danced, Elara was elbow-deep in a crate of crystal glassware that needed to be hand-dried to a diamond shine. Vivienne had decided that hiring a full-service staff was frivolous, given the recent market fluctuations, and Elara was the easiest way to cut costs. "Don't just stand there daydreaming," the head caterer snapped, shoving a tray of hors d'oeuvres toward her. "The guests are waiting." Elara took the tray without a word, her expressive eyes focused on the task. She moved through the service hallways, catching glimpses of the party through the swinging doors, the life that was supposed to be hers, visible but unreachable. While the music thudded rhythmically above, a different kind of tension was brewing in the soundproofed sanctuary of Richard Hallstrom's study. Richard sat behind his mahogany desk, his face ashen, looking at a series of red-lined ledgers that signaled the end of his empire. Across from him sat Uncle Minho, a man whose smile never reached his predatory eyes. Vivienne stood by the window, clutching a glass of wine so tightly her knuckles were white. "The banks are moving in, Richard," Minho said, his voice a low, oily drawl. "By the end of the month, this house, the cars, even Serafina's birthday diamonds will be seized. You've played the market and lost." "There has to be a way," Vivienne hissed, her voice trembling. "We are the Hallstroms, we don't just disappear." Minho leaned forward, a slow, dark grin spreading across his face. "There is an alliance. My nephew, Kwon T-Ryuk, is looking for a wife. He needs the respectability of an old money name to mask the, let's call it the grit of his business. If you provide a bride, he will erase your debts and inject 10 billion won into your firm by morning." Vivienne's glass shattered on the floor. "T-Ryuk, the death god, he's a monster. They say he has more scars than skin and a heart made of jagged glass. I won't send my Serafina to be his plaything. She's too fragile. It would kill her." Richard looked at the door, where Elara had just entered to set down a fresh carafe of water. He watched her for a moment, the grace in her movements, the stoic strength in her posture. She was a Hallstrom by law, even if she had never been one by love. "We won't send Serafina," Richard said, his voice turning cold and clinical. Elara froze at the edge of the desk, her heart skipping a beat. She saw the way her adoptive father was looking at her, the way a farmer looks at a head of cattle before a sale. "We have another daughter," Richard continued, his gaze narrowing on Elara. "One we saved from the gutter, one who owes us every breath she has taken for the last 15 years. T-Ryuk wants a Hallstrom bride to secure the deal. He never specified which one." "Elara," Vivienne whispered, the horror in her voice quickly giving way to a sickening relief. She looked at the girl as if she were a piece of furniture they were finally moving to the attic. "Yes, she's resilient. She's used to hardship. She won't break as easily as our Serafina." Elara's hands began to shake, the water in the carafe rippling. You can't be serious," she breathed, her voice a fragile rasp. "You're talking about me as if I'm a piece of scrap metal." Richard stood up, his towering presence casting a long, dark shadow over her. "You should be honored, Alara. Your life has finally found a purpose. You are going to save this family." "I am not your currency, father," she whispered, the word father tasting like ash in her mouth. "You are whatever I say you are," Richard snapped, his face reddening. "Go upstairs, clean yourself up. Tomorrow you meet your future, and if you even think about refusing, I will throw you out tonight with nothing but the clothes on your back. No school, no name, no future. You will be back in the dirt where we found you." Alara backed out of the room, the sound of Serafina's laughter from the ballroom suddenly sounding like a death knell. She realized then that the miracle and the mistake had led to this moment, the ultimate sacrifice. She was being traded to a man the world feared to protect the girl the world adored. As she fled to her small, dark room, she didn't see Uncle Minho's satisfied smirk or the way the shadows in the corner of the study seemed to ripple with anticipation. The debt of blood had been called in, and the disposable daughter was the only coin they had left. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Hallstrom estate, but it brought no warmth to the small, cold library where Alara had been summoned. She stood by a wall of leather-bound books, her fingers tracing the spine of a novel she had read a dozen times to escape the suffocating silence of her life. The door clicked shut with a finality that made her shoulders tense. Richard and Vivienne stood before her, a united front of tailored silk and icy determination. "We've spoken to the lawyers," Richard began, his voice devoid of the fatherly warmth he saved exclusively for Serafina. He didn't sit. He paced the room like a man closing a difficult merger. "The wedding is set for next month. It will be private, efficient, and legally binding. You will marry Kwon Ti-ryuk, and in return, the Hallstrom name remains untarnished." Alara looked at him, her chest aching with a hollow, vibrating fear. "You're selling me to a criminal, a man people whisper about in terror. Do you even care what happens to me once those doors close?" Vivienne stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood. She reached out not to offer a hug, but to adjust the collar of Alara's cheap blouse with a look of profound distaste. "Don't be dramatic, Alara. We are asking you to do one thing for the family that gave you everything. Think of the 4 years we spent grieving before you arrived. Think of the tuition, the food, the roof over your head. Is this how you repay us? With selfishness?" "Repay you?" Alara's voice trembled, a single hot tear spilling over her lashes. "I have worked in your kitchen while you threw parties. I have worn hand-me-downs while Serafina wore diamonds. I have lived like a servant in my own home. I don't owe you a marriage to a monster." The mask of civility finally slipped from Richard's face, revealing the ruthless corporate shark beneath. He stepped into her personal space, his shadow engulfing her. "Listen to me very carefully. You have no money. You have no degree yet. You have no biological family to run to. If you refuse this, I will sign the papers to annul your adoption today. I will strip you of the Hallstrom name and have security escort you to the gate. You will be a nameless, homeless girl on the streets of Seoul with nothing but the clothes on your back. Is that the freedom you want?" Alara looked at Vivienne, searching for a flicker of the woman who had once rocked her to sleep. But her adoptive mother only smoothed her skirt, her eyes fixed on the jewelry she was terrified of losing. In that moment, the last fraying thread of Alara's hope snapped. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. They had never loved her. She wasn't their daughter. She was a backup plan, an insurance policy that was finally being cashed in. A strange, cold calm began to settle over her. If she stayed here, she would remain a ghost, a punching bag for Serafina's ego and a tool for Richard's greed. If she went to Kwon Ti-ryuk, she was walking into the unknown. He might be a monster, as the rumors suggested, but at least he was a monster she didn't know. He couldn't hurt her any more than the people who had pretended to be her parents for 15 years. She wiped the tear from her cheek, her oval face hardening into a mask of stoic resolve. She looked Richard directly in the eyes, a feat she had never dared before. "Fine," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I'll marry him. I'll be the sacrifice that saves your precious Serafina and your dying business." Vivienne let out a long, audible sigh of relief, reaching out to pat Alara's arm as if she were a well-behaved pet. "I knew you. Understand, dear. It's for the best." But understand this, Alara continued, pulling her arm away. The moment I sign that marriage certificate, I am no longer a Hallstrom. I am his. Do not call me when you're lonely. Do not come to me when you need more money. You wanted me out of this house, and you got your wish. From today on, consider your miracle child dead. Richard scoffed, already turning to leave the room. As long as the debt is cleared, you can play act as whatever you like, Alara. Just don't embarrass us at the altar. As they left her alone in the library, Alara sank into a chair, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. She was terrified, yes, but for the first time in a decade, she felt a sliver of something else. Anticipation. She was leaving the Hallstrom prison. She was stepping into the den of a dragon, and while the world feared Kwon T. Ryuk, Alara found herself hoping that the man who lived in the dark would at least be honest about his cruelty. She was done with the fake smiles and the conditional love. She looked out the window at the sprawling gardens she would never walk in again. She was going to marry a Mafia king, and she would use his power to ensure she never had to look back. If she was going to be sold, she would make sure the price was her absolute, total freedom. The master suite of the Kwon estate was a sprawling expanse of cold marble and obsidian glass, overlooking a city that seemed to shimmer with 1,000 indifferent lights. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of lilies and the suffocating weight of silence. Alara sat on the edge of the massive, silk-draped bed, her frame looking agonizingly small against the grandeur. She was a vision of shattered innocence. Her elegant white lace gown, adorned with delicate floral embroidery, felt like a shroud rather than a celebratory garment. Her long, voluminous dark curls were a messy halo beneath a sheer bridal veil that lay spread across the bed like a fallen cloud. She wasn't just a bride, she was a prisoner of war. Large, hot tears streamed down her deep brown cheeks, soaking into the lace of her bodice. Her body shook with uncontrollable tremors. Her hands clutched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Every sound in the hallway made her flinch. She had heard the rumors of Kwon T. Ryuk, the man they called the Reaper. A man who ruled the underworld with a heart of stone and hands stained in shadow. Her parents had thrown her to him to save their own blood, and now the door was about to open. The heavy thud of the door's mechanism made her heart stop. T. Ryuk stepped into the room. He was a towering presence, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his muscular chest straining against a fitted black dress shirt. He had rolled up his sleeves, revealing thick, corded forearms covered in intricate ink. The bold dragon tattoo on the side of his neck seemed to pulse in the dim light. He didn't look like a husband. He looked like a predator entering his den. Alara's breath hitched in a sob as she squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the first strike, the first demand, the first sign of the cruelty she had been promised. She heard his heavy footsteps across the marble, slow and deliberate, until the heat of his body radiated against her frozen skin. "Look at me," he commanded. His voice wasn't the jagged, roaring sound she expected. It was a low, resonant baritone, vibrating with an intensity that made the air feel thick. Trembling, Alara forced her eyes open. She looked up through her tear-blurred vision into a face of sharp, masculine angles and a jawline that could cut glass. His dark eyes were calm, serious, and unfathomably deep. He didn't smile. He simply stared at her with a gaze so focused it felt like he was reading the very map of her soul. I'll do whatever you want," she whispered, her voice a brittle rasp of desperation. "Just, please don't hurt me." A flicker of something, anger, pain, crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. T. Ryuk moved then, but it wasn't with violence. He lowered himself, his tall frame kneeling before her on the plush carpet so that they were eye to level. It was a position of supplication that shocked the breath from her lungs. Slowly, almost tentatively, he reached out. His large, tattooed hand was warm as it cupped her face. His thumb, rough-textured but incredibly gentle, brushed a massive tear from her cheek. He didn't pull away. He lingered there, his palm cradling her jaw as if she were the most fragile piece of porcelain in the world. "The Hallstroms told me they were sending me a daughter who was grateful to be here," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, protective hum. "They didn't tell me they were sending me a girl they had broken into pieces." Alara stared at him, her lips parting in shock. They said you were a monster." "I am a monster to the world, Alara," he replied, his thumb tracing the curve of her lower lip. "But to you, I am the man who paid a king's ransom to get you out of that house. I didn't buy a wife, I bought a queen." His touch wasn't cold. It was possessive, yes, but it was weighted with a strange, dark tenderness that she had never felt in 20 years of living. He didn't look at her with the clinical indifference of Richard or the poisonous pity of Vivienne. He looked at her with a hunger that was terrifying, yet oddly grounding. "Why?" she breathed, the sobbing finally beginning to subside as the heat of his hand thawed the ice in her veins. "Because they looked at you and saw a burden," T. Ryuk whispered, his eyes narrowing as he leaned closer, his scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco enveloping her. "I looked at you and saw the only thing worth owning in this city. You will never cry for them again, Alara. From this night on, anyone who makes you shed a tear will answer to the dragon." He leaned forward, pressing a firm, lingering kiss to her forehead. It was a seal, a vow of protection that felt more binding than the legal papers they had signed that afternoon. Alara didn't pull away. For the first time in her life, she let herself lean into the strength of someone else, realizing that the monster she had feared might just be the only person in the world who truly wanted her. The transition from the drafty corridors of the Hallstrom estate to the gilded fortress of the Kwon mansion was not merely a change of address. It was a total reconstruction of Alara's reality. In the weeks following their wedding night, the death god of Seoul transformed into a silent, omnipresent architect of her joy. T. Ryuk's obsession did not manifest in chains or commands, but in an overwhelming, almost aggressive level of care that left Alara dizzy. It began with the wardrobe. One morning, Alara woke to find the walk-in closet, a room larger than her entire bedroom at the Hallstroms, filled with the scent of fresh silk and Italian leather. Every garment she had brought from her past life, the faded hand-me-downs and the cheap, scratchy cottons, had been vanished. In their place hung racks of bespoke gowns, tailored blazers in shades of cream and midnight, and cashmere sweaters that felt like a second skin. "They were an insult to your skin," T. Ryuk said simply, leaning against the doorframe, his dark eyes tracking her as she touched a sleeve of pleated chiffon. He walked toward her, his presence domestic yet dangerous, and pressed a heavy, matte black card into her palm. "This has no limit. If you want a building, buy it. If you want a gallery, take it. I never want to hear you ask for permission to exist again." Alara looked at the card, then back at him. "T. Ryuk, I don't need all of this. I don't even know how to spend this kind of money." "Then learn," he murmured, his tattooed hand reaching out to tuck a loose curl behind her ear. His touch was no longer a shock, it was a tether. "The Hallstroms raised you to be a beggar at your own table. I am raising you to be the table." But the true shift happened in his glass-walled study. T. Ryuk sat her down across from his mahogany desk and slid a thick stack of legal documents toward her. Alara expected a prenuptial agreement or a list of rules. Instead, she saw her name typed in bold letters alongside a percentage that made her breath hitch. "You are now a 15% shareholder in Kwon Industries," he stated, his voice as matter-of-fact as if he were discussing the weather. "It is a voting share. Your signature now carries the weight of billions. If my board of directors wants to pass a merger, they have to look you in the eye and earn your approval." Alara felt a lump form in her throat, a mixture of gratitude and a deep, aching grief for the girl she used to be. For 15 years, Richard Hallstrom had refused to give her a single share in the family business, claiming she didn't have the blood for it. Serafina had been promised everything, while Alara was promised nothing. And here was a man the world called a monster, a man who had known her for less than a month, handing her the keys to his kingdom. "Why?" she whispered, the old insecurity flickering in her expressive eyes. "You barely know me." T. Ryuk stood up, walking around the desk to stand between her knees. He placed his hands on the arms of her chair, pinning her in with his strength. "I know that you survived a desert for 15 years without turning bitter. I know that you have more steel in your spine than any man I employ. And I know," he leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, "that I like the way the world looks when you're standing at the top of it." As the days turned into months, Alara realized the bitter irony of her life. The loving family that had adopted her had spent a decade trying to shrink her soul until it fit into a kitchen cupboard. The cruel husband who had bought her was spent every waking hour expanding her world until she could touch the stars. She began to walk differently. The stoic, downward gaze she had perfected at the Hallstroms evaporated, replaced by the steady, quiet confidence of a woman who knew she was protected. She spent her afternoons studying the markets and her evenings wrapped in T-Ryuk's arms, listening to the steady beat of a heart that the world claimed didn't exist. She was no longer the miracle child or the mistake. She was Madame Kwon, a shareholder, a power player, and the sole obsession of the most dangerous man in Korea. The Hallstroms had thrown her into the mouth of a dragon, hoping she would be consumed. They had no idea that the dragon had simply decided to give her his fire. The Hallstrom mansion, once a beacon of unassailable prestige, now felt like a gilded cage echoing with the whispers of creditors. The 10 billion won injection from the Kwon Alliance had patched the holes in their sinking ship, but it hadn't changed the wind. Richard sat in his study, nursing a glass of scotch that tasted like defeat, while Vivienne paced the Persian rug, her eyes fixed on the television screen mounted above the fireplace. The evening news was not covering the Hallstrom's lackluster quarterly earnings. Instead, the screen was filled with the radiant image of Alara. She was stepping out of a sleek black limousine at a charity gala in Gangnam, draped in a gown of midnight velvet that complemented her glowing skin like a masterpiece. Beside her, the death god himself, Kwon T-Ryuk, was captured in a rare, candid moment. He wasn't looking at the cameras or the dignitaries. He was leaning down, his tattooed hand resting possessively on the small of Alara's back, his sharp features softened into an expression of unmistakable devotion. The headlines scrolling across the bottom read, Madame Kwon appointed head of Kwon Foundation, the new face of Seoul's elite. It should have been me, a voice hissed from the doorway. Serafina stood there, her face contorted into a mask of pure, ugly resentment. Her golden child luster had dimmed. Without the constant infusion of new designer wardrobes and the social standing of a thriving empire, she felt stagnant. She clutched a tablet, scrolling through viral clips of T-Ryuk shielding Alara from the rain, of him buying an entire jewelry boutique during a lunch date, of him looking at Alara as if she were the sun. "You told me he was a monster," Serafina screamed, throwing the tablet onto the sofa. "You said he would break her. You said I was being saved from a nightmare. But look at her. She's a billionaire shareholder. She's the most talked-about woman in the country. He's obsessed with her." Vivienne stopped her packing, her face pale as she stared at the screen. The regret was a physical weight in the room. They had expected to hear stories of Alara's misery. They had waited for the phone call where she would beg to come home so they could gloat. Instead, they were watching the burden they had discarded become the very pinnacle of the society they were struggling to stay in. "We miscalculated," Richard muttered, his voice hollow. He realized now that he hadn't just sold a daughter, he had given away the most valuable asset he had ever possessed. He had handed the keys to the Kwon fortune to the one person who had every reason to hate him. "Miscalculated," Serafina laughed, a shrill, hysterical sound. "You gave her my life. That should be my black card. Those should be my diamonds. Why is the miracle girl ruling over billions while I'm stuck here watching the walls close in?" The silence that followed was heavy with a toxic mixture of jealousy and desperation. The Hallstroms had spent years convincing themselves that Alara was worth nothing, but the world was currently proving she was worth everything. Seeing her treated with a tenderness they had never bothered to show her didn't make them feel guilty. It made them feel robbed. "She's changed," Vivienne whispered, narrowing her eyes at the image of Alara gracefully shaking hands with an ambassador. "She isn't that quiet, trembling girl anymore. She's dangerous now." "She's only dangerous because of him," Serafina countered, her eyes gleaming with a dark, frantic light. "If he leaves her, she's nothing. If we can show him what she really is, a nameless beggar we picked up out of pity, he'll throw her back into the gutter where she belongs." Serafina walked over to the TV, tracing the outline of T-Ryuk's face on the glass. The obsession she saw him directing at Alara was a prize she now craved with a sickly fervor. She didn't want the man. She wanted the power, the protection, and the absolute destruction of the sister who had dared to outshine her. In the shadows of the study, the plan began to form, fueled by the bitter realization that they had traded a diamond for a temporary reprieve. They had sent Alara to a monster, hoping she would be consumed, but seeing her thrive was a far greater torture. As the news segment ended, Serafina turned to her parents, her voice dropping to a poisonous whisper. "We gave her to him," Serafina said. "It's only fair that we take her back." The Hallstroms had once traded Alara to save their business. Now, they were prepared to destroy her to save their pride. They had forgotten that Alara was no longer a ghost in their hallway. She was the heart of a dragon, and the dragon was not known for his mercy. The invitation arrived not on the usual cold, legal stationery of Hallstrom Holdings, but on a hand-pressed card that smelled faintly of the jasmine perfume Vivienne had worn during Alara's childhood. The message was a masterpiece of manipulation, a mother's plea for forgiveness, an admission of grievous pride, and a request for one private dinner to bridge the chasm before the family name faded into obscurity. Tirayuk had been suspicious from the moment his security team intercepted the courier. He stood in their private lounge, his thumb tracing the dragon on his neck, his eyes like flint. "It's a trap, Alara," he had grumbled, his voice low and vibrating with a protective growl. "Wolves don't become sheep just because they're hungry." But Alara, draped in a silk robe that cost more than the Hallstrom's remaining liquid assets, had looked at the card with a weary sort of hope. She didn't want their love, she had Tirayuk's obsession for that, but she wanted the closure of a final word. She wanted to look them in the eye as an equal and tell them she was finally whole. "I know who they are now, Tirayuk," she whispered, leaning into his broad chest. "They can't hurt a woman who is already loved." Reluctantly, he had let her go, but only after doubling her detail and ensuring her jewelry was embedded with trackers that linked directly to his heartbeat. The dinner was held at a secluded estate the Hallstroms had rented, a place far from the prying eyes of the sole paparazzi. When Alara stepped into the dining room, she looked every bit the queen. Her deep brown skin glowed against a gold-threaded gown, and the sheer confidence in her stride made Vivienne's smile falter for a fraction of a second. "Alara, darling," Vivienne cooed, reaching out with trembling hands. "You look expensive." "I look like myself, Vivienne," Alara replied, taking her seat. The air was thick with the scent of overripe lilies and something metallic, an underlying tension that made the hair on her arms stand up. Richard sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of false humility, while Serafina sat across from Alara, her eyes hidden behind a veil of faux sweetness. The conversation was a shallow stream of apologies and remember-whens, but as the main course was served, the atmosphere shifted. Serafina kept checking her phone, her thumb twitching with an agitated rhythm. "You know, Alara," Serafina said, her voice dropping the sweetness for something sharper. "Tirayuk is a man of high standards. He values loyalty above all else. It would be a shame if he found out his queen wasn't as pure as he thought." Alara's fork clattered against the fine china. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means," Richard interrupted, his voice returning to the cold, corporate steel Alara knew so well, "that a marriage built on a transaction can be undone by a scandal." Before Alara could stand, the lights flickered and died. The silent, elegant room was suddenly filled with the heavy thud of combat boots and the smell of cheap tobacco. Alara felt rough hands seize her shoulders, pulling her back from the table. She reached for the panic button on her bracelet, but a stinging blow to her wrist sent her spinning. "Don't worry, sister," Serafina's voice hissed through the darkness, jagged with a manic triumph. "By the time we're done, the Reaper will find you in a situation so compromising, so filthy, that he'll beg me to take your place just to scrub the shame from his name. You were always just the placeholder. Tonight, the real Hallstrom takes the throne." Alara struggled, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She heard the sound of a van door sliding open in the courtyard. She realized with a sickening jolt that this wasn't about an apology. They hadn't invited her for dinner. They had invited her to her own execution of character. They were going to kidnap her, stage a scene of betrayal, and offer Serafina as the pure alternative to the gutter-born wife. As a hood was shoved over her head, the last thing Alara thought of wasn't the fear of the thugs. It was the look on T. Ryuk's face when he realized she was gone. She had walked into the trap out of a desire for peace, but as she was tossed into the back of the vibrating vehicle, she realized her family had made one fatal error. They thought they were kidnapping a victim. They didn't realize they had just kidnapped the only thing keeping the dragon of soul from burning their world to the ground. Deep in the Kwon mansion, a silent alarm pulsed red on a monitor. T. Ryuk stood up, his jaw set in a line of terrifying stillness. He didn't call the police. He didn't call a lawyer. He reached for the heavy tactical vest on his wall and whispered a single, lethal promise to the empty room. I told them what happens when she cries. The warehouse on the edge of the docks smelled of stagnant salt water and the rot of abandoned dreams. Inside, Alara sat bound to a rusted chair, the gold threads of her gown mocking the grim surroundings. Serafina paced before her, a glass of champagne in one hand and a camera in the other, her face twisted with a manic, desperate glee. Behind her, Richard and Vivienne stood in the shadows, watching as their hired thugs prepared to stage the scandal that would ruin Alara's reputation forever. One photo, Alara, Serafina hissed, leaning in close. One photo of you in this filth, surrounded by these men, and the Reaper will discard you like the trash you are. He'll be disgusted, and when he is, I'll be there to offer him the dignity he deserves. Alara looked up, her expressive eyes remarkably calm despite the tears of frustration staining her cheeks. You still don't get it, do you? He didn't marry me for the Hallstrom name. He married me because he saw the heart you tried to kill. You think you're taking his throne, but you're only inviting his fire. Enough talk, Richard snapped from the shadows, his voice tight with the pressure of his crumbling empire. Do it. Take the photos and let's end this. The words had barely left his lips when the heavy steel doors of the warehouse didn't just open. They vanished. A controlled explosion tore the hinges from the frame, the shockwave shattering every window in the building. Through the billowing smoke and the rain of glass, a silhouette emerged that made the hired thugs freeze in terror. Kwon T. Ryuk didn't come with an army, he came as a force of nature. He was stripped of his blazer, his black dress shirt clinging to his muscular frame, the dragon tattoo on his neck appearing to writhe in the flickering emergency lights. He moved with a ruthless violence that was almost beautiful in its precision. The first thug reached for a weapon. T. Ryuk was on him in a heartbeat, a single blow sending the man spiraling into a stack of wooden crates with a sickening crack of bone. The second man swung a lead pipe, but T. Ryuk caught it midair, his grip so powerful the metal seemed to groan. With a guttural roar, he wrenched the weapon away and used the man's own momentum to drive him into the concrete floor. It wasn't a fight, it was a systematic dismantling. T. Ryuk, Serafina screamed, dropping her glass. It's not what it looks like, we were saving you, she's a fraud, she's... T. Ryuk ignored her, his eyes locked on Alara. He reached her in 3 long strides, his blood-stained knuckles trembling as he sliced through her zip ties with a tactical knife. The moment she was free, he didn't pull her away. He stood her up, keeping one protective arm anchored around her waist, and turned to face the Hallstroms. The air in the warehouse turned sub-zero. The death god had arrived, and he was hungry. You wanted to see the monster. T. Ryuk's voice was a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to rattle the very foundations of the building. You wanted to see the man who ruins lives. He gestured to his men, who had swarmed the building in the wake of his entry, rounding up the remaining thugs with clinical efficiency. T. Ryuk pulled a tablet from his pocket and tossed it at Richard's feet. On the screen, a live feed showed the Hallstrom's remaining offshore accounts being drained to 0 in real time. While you were busy playing with cameras, T. Ryuk hissed, stepping toward Richard, I was erasing you. Every asset, every secret, every brick of your precious name. I have the recordings of your peace dinner. I have the testimony of the men you hired. You didn't just kidnap my wife, you declared war on the dragon. Vivienne let out a strangled sob, reaching for Richard's arm, but T. Ryuk's gaze cut her down. Don't look at her, he growled, nodding toward Alara. You lost the right to breathe the same air as her the moment you put that hood over her head. He turned his attention back to Serafina, who was trembling so violently she could barely stand. T-Ryuk leaned in, his face inches from hers, his dark eyes burning with a demonic light. You wanted my obsession, Serafina. You wanted to know what it feels like to have my undivided attention. He smiled, a cold, jagged expression that held no warmth. Now you have it, and I promise you, you will regret every second of it. He didn't kill them. He knew that for people like the Hallstroms, a quick death was a mercy they didn't deserve. He wanted them to feel the slow, grinding weight of the cruelty they had so casually projected onto him. Take them, T-Ryuk commanded his men, his voice absolute. Strip them of everything. I want them to see the world from the gutter they tried to push her into. He turned back to Alara, his posture softening instantly as he tucked her head into the hollow of his neck. He shielded her from the sight of her family being dragged away in disgrace, his large hand cradling her face with that same dark, possessive tenderness. It's over, Alara, he whispered into her hair, his heart beating a steady, furious rhythm against hers. They can't touch you. No one will ever touch you again. As he carried her out of the wreckage and into the pouring rain, the warehouse burned behind them, a funeral pyre for the Hallstrom name and the birth of a new, untouchable reign. The downfall of the Hallstroms was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing erosion orchestrated with the cold precision of a master architect. Within 48 hours of the warehouse raid, Richard Hallstrom's name had become a contagion in the financial world. Every contract was nullified, every bank account frozen under the weight of racketeering and kidnapping charges that T-Ryuk's legal team had gift-wrapped for the prosecutor's office. The blood debt they had tried to settle with Alara's life had returned to claim their souls instead. The morning the movers arrived at the Hallstrom estate, Vivienne stood in the foyer, clutching a single designer handbag as if it could keep the walls from closing in. Richard sat on the stairs, his head in his hands, staring at the empty spaces where portraits of a perfect family once hung. Serafina screamed at the men carrying out her vanity, but her voice was a ghost in a house that no longer belonged to her. By sunset, the gates were locked, the gold-leafed sign was removed, and the Hallstroms were cast out into the very city they had looked down upon for decades. Months passed, and the seasons bled from the harsh bite of winter into the blooming warmth of a Seoul spring. In a cramped, gray district far from the glittering lights of Gangnam, 3 figures moved through the dawn mist. Richard, his hands calloused and shaking, hauled heavy crates of produce for a local wholesaler. Beside him, Vivienne, her once perfect skin weathered by the sun and cheap soap, scrubbed the sidewalks in front of a storefront for a few meager coins. Serafina stood at the corner, her designer clothes replaced by a stained apron, handing out flyers for a discount grocery store, her eyes hollow and fixed on the pavement to avoid the pitying stares of passers-by. They lived in a one-room apartment with peeling wallpaper and a leaking roof. The tattered house they had once joked about in their worst nightmares. Every night, the silence between them was deafening, filled only with the bitter taste of regret and the knowledge that they had traded a queen for a handful of ash. High above them, on the private road leading to the Kwon headquarters, a sleek black motorcade glided through the streets like a shadow. Inside the lead limousine, the air was cool and smelled of fresh rain and expensive cedar. Alara sat nestled against T-Ryuk's side, her head resting on his broad shoulder. She was dressed in a suit of ivory silk, her deep brown skin glowing with a peace that no diamond could replicate. She was no longer just a shareholder. She was the heart of the Kwon Empire, a woman whose name inspired respect and whose hands moved billions toward the charities she had built from the ground up. T-Ryuk reached down, his large, tattooed hand finding hers and interlacing their fingers. He didn't need to speak. The possessive warmth of his grip said everything. He looked at her not as a trophy, but as his North Star. His obsession had matured into a deep, unshakable devotion, a love that had started in the dark and now thrived in the light. As the motorcade slowed near a crowded intersection, Alara's gaze drifted out the tinted window. For a fleeting second, she saw them. She saw Richard straining under the weight of a crate, and Vivienne hunched over a bucket of gray water. She saw Serafina, looking small and broken, as a gust of wind scattered her flyers across the dirty street. The old Alara, the one who had lived as a ghost in their hallways, might have felt a pang of sorrow. But the woman sitting beside the dragon felt only a profound, quiet closure. She didn't ask the driver to stop. She didn't roll down the window to gloat. She simply squeezed Tirayuk's hand and looked away, back toward the horizon where their future waited. "You're quiet," Tirayuk murmured, his voice a low, protective hum against her ear. "I was just thinking," Alara replied, turning to look into the dark eyes that had become her sanctuary. "That for the first time in my life, I don't feel like I'm running away from anything. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Tirayuk leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that tasted of freedom and forever. The miracle child had finally found her true miracle, not in the family that had abandoned her, but in the monster who had taught her how to fly. As the motorcade sped away, leaving the rags and the ruins of the Hallstroms in the rearview mirror, Alara closed her eyes and smiled. The debt was paid, the shadows were gone, and the queen was finally home.